My golden child sister got everything until the family discovered the scapegoat was the only one who actually succeeded. The night my family finally saw me clearly. It happened under a chandelier my mother had spent 3 months pretending she didn't regret buying. It hung above the dining room table like a crystal accusation, bright and expensive, and just a little too large for the room. The way most of my mother's choices were. She liked things that made an impression from the street. She liked polished surfaces. She liked the performance of stability more than stability itself. That night, all of us were gathered under that light because my sister Vanessa had called what she described in the family group chat as an important announcement dinner. Important. In our family, usually meant 2 things. Either Vanessa wanted applause, or she wanted money. Sometimes she wanted both. I was the last one to arrive. I stood in the foyer for a second, still holding my car keys, listening to the layered sounds of a family who had always known how to speak warmly around a wound, as if warmth itself could erase what caused it. Silverware. Forced laughter. My mother's voice floating up from the dining room. Bright and breathless. My father's lower voice. Are full of that familiar certainty. He wore the way other men wore watches. Vanessa laughing at something before anyone else had finished hearing it. As if she had been born understanding that the first laugh in a room usually sets the terms for everyone else. My Aunt Ruth saw me first. Her expression changed in that small, private way. People's expressions change when they remember a truth the rest of the room has worked hard to keep decorative. Claire, she said, getting up from the table. You made it? I hugged her with one arm. She was the only person in my family who never treated my presence like either a problem or a duty. Everyone else looked up. Vanessa was at the head of the table on the right side, where my mother should have been if this were really my parents' dinner. But it was Vanessa's event, which meant the room had already bent around her before I walked in. She looked glossy and expensive in a cream silk blouse and gold hoops. Her hair blown out in the kind of soft waves that only seem natural if they cost $120. My mother smiled too quickly when she saw me. That was always her tell. When she was genuinely happy, her face softened. When she was bracing for unpredictability, she smiled like she was smoothing a wrinkle no one else had mentioned. You're late, she said. It wasn't a greeting. It never was. I looked at the clock over the bar cart. I'm 4 minutes early, I said. Vanessa laughed. God, she said. Still like this? Like this. That had always been my family's favorite phrase for me. Too literal, too sensitive, too serious, too cold, too hard to please, too quiet until suddenly I wasn't. In my family, my sister got adjectives like radiant and spontaneous and charismatic. I got like this. I took the empty chair nearest the end of the table. Not because anyone saved it for me, but because over the years I had learned to sit where exits were visible. If stories like this resonate with you, like and subscribe, but only if they really do. Some stories are dramatic because people are loud. Others are dramatic because people smile while they keep assigning one child the burden of everyone else's comfort. My mother had gone all out on dinner. Roast chicken glazed with herbs and butter. Baby carrots arranged in an oval serving dish. A salad no one would actually eat. Candles lit in the middle of the table, even though the overhead light was already too bright. Everything trying very hard to suggest the kind of family moment that gets framed rather than remembered accurately. My father sat across from me in a navy quarter zip and a look of patient tolerance, as if he had invited one difficult client to a meal and intended to handle it gracefully for the benefit of the others. Beside him was Vanessa's husband, Luke, who had the permanently damp, agreeable energy of a man who had mistaken marrying charisma for marrying depth. He smiled whenever anyone else smiled. He nodded as if he were being interviewed for a role he had already gotten. Vanessa lifted her wine glass and tapped it once with her nail. "Okay," she said. "Can we start?" Start. As if this dinner had not really begun until the sun turned toward her. My father smiled at her the way he used to when she was 11 and brought home C+s wrapped in tears. My mother straightened in her chair. Luke put his arm around the back of Vanessa's seat. Aunt Ruth took a sip of water and looked at me over the rim of the glass. Vanessa said, "I wanted everyone here because Luke and I have decided this is the year we stop playing small." That line should tell you everything you need to know about my sister. Vanessa had never once in her life played small. She had played broke. She had played misunderstood. She had played unlucky. She had played undersupported, despite being the single most oversupported person I had ever known. But small? Never. She liked an audience too much. She smiled, waiting. Because pauses are powerful when you've spent your life being rewarded for making people lean in. Then she said, "We're launching the studio." My mother clasped both hands under her chin. My father said, "There it is." Luke nodded with the intensity of a man hearing news for the first time that had definitely been rehearsed in the car. Vanessa turned toward me for half a second. And there it was again, that tiny, satisfying little flicker she always had when she thought she was about to announce something that would place her back where she believed she belonged. "Above me," she said. "A full creative brand space. Content, photography, social campaigns, women-led consulting, event visuals. It's everything I've wanted to build." Everything she'd wanted to build. There was a funny thing about Vanessa. She always spoke as if wanting something were morally adjacent to earning it. My father leaned back in his chair and smiled around the table. "She's been thinking strategically," he said. That almost made me laugh. Vanessa had not thought strategically a day in her life. She had thought beautifully, urgently, emotionally, impulsively, in spirals and moods and dramatic declarations. But strategically? No. Vanessa had survived by being the kind of person other people reorganized themselves around. That is not strategy. That is social gravity. And she had plenty of it. My mother looked at me and said, "Isn't that exciting?" That question wasn't really for me. It was one of the little family rituals we still performed out of habit. The moment where they invited me to validate a version of reality they had already agreed on before I entered the room. "It's ambitious," I said. Vanessa smiled tightly. "She means congratulations," my mother said. Aunt Ruth said nothing. She just looked down at her plate. That was the first signal of the night. The second came when Vanessa slid a folder onto the table. It was cream-colored with embossed tabs. The kind of folder people buy when they want paperwork to seem more official than the numbers inside can support. My father said, "Claire, since you're the practical one, maybe you can look this over." And there it was. That old family trick? Vanessa got the spotlight. I got the labor. Always. Before I tell you why that folder mattered, let me take you back to where all of this really started. Because nobody becomes the family scapegoat in one day. It happens through repetition, through narrative, through the small daily economies of praise and blame. I grew up in a house where my sister was treated like weather, and I was treated like infrastructure. Vanessa was 18 months older than me. which meant she got the first chance to become the family story, and I got handed the role left over after everyone got used to her. She was bright in a social way, good with people, good at walking into a room and making herself feel central without seeming to try. Even when she was little, adults described her as magnetic. I was described as capable. If you have ever been the child described as capable in a family that worships charm, you know exactly what that means. It means they admire what you can do for them and resent what you reveal about what they won't do for themselves. My mother loved appearances. Not in the shallow way people usually mean, though she had some of that too. She loved the emotional shape of a family that looked enviable from the outside. Holiday cards, good schools, matching dresses when we were young, photos where everyone was angled just enough toward the camera to suggest affection without actually needing to feel it. My father loved hierarchy. He liked knowing who had promise, who needed correction, who would justify investment, who would return value. He never said it in those words when I was little. Children do not hear adults speak in clean summaries. They hear them in repeated atmospheres. Vanessa was who my parents felt proud around. I was who they felt efficient around. When Vanessa forgot homework, she was overwhelmed. When I forgot something, I was careless. When Vanessa cried, the whole house tilted toward comfort. When I cried, I was asked what exactly I thought tears were going to solve. My earliest memory of understanding this wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday. I was 9, maybe 10. Vanessa had broken a ceramic lamp in the den chasing our dog, even though my mother had already yelled twice for us not to run in the house. My mother came in, looked at the shattered vase on the rug, looked at Vanessa's wide eyes, then looked at me. "Claire," she said, "why weren't you watching her?" That was the first time I remember feeling something in me go very still. Not angry, not even sad. Exactly. You still. Because I understood with the clean, humiliating clarity children sometimes have that the facts of a room were not the same thing as the assigned meaning of a room. Vanessa had broken the lamp, but I had failed to prevent Vanessa from being Vanessa. And that, in my family, was always worse. My sister grew into the role beautifully. She learned that tears could buy time, that charm could erase follow-through, that wanting something with enough visible feeling often made people call it destiny instead of appetite. She danced for 6 years and quit the month. Recital fees got higher. She joined student council for 1 semester and left when she had to organize something instead of just speak at it. She wanted a boutique cupcake business at 16, until she realized waking up at 5 was part of baking. She wanted to be an interior designer, until a teacher pointed out that deadlines existed. She wanted to study psychology because she loved understanding people, which in Vanessa's vocabulary meant she loved watching them rearrange themselves around her. My parents called this exploring. I called it expensive, but not out loud. I learned early that saying true things before the room is ready for them does not make you brave in a family like mine. It makes you disloyal. By 13, I was babysitting and doing inventory at a hardware store owned by a friend of my father's on Saturdays. Not because anyone pushed me into labor, at least not directly, because I understood money in the way children raised in uneven houses often do, as proof, as exit, as the opposite of permission. Vanessa spent money as if wanting counted as contribution. I kept envelopes in a shoebox under my bed and labeled them gas. Books. Emergency. When I was 15, I got a scholarship to a summer academic program in Columbus. It was free, except for travel and some meal costs. which I covered with my savings. I remember standing in the kitchen with the acceptance packet in my hand, waiting for the kind of reaction I had seen my parents give Vanessa for much smaller things. My father said, "That's nice." My mother said, "What will your sister do all summer if you're gone?" Not what will you learn. Not congratulations. Not how proud we are. What will your sister do? That sentence still lives in me, because it was so ordinary, so untheatrical, and because that is how family hierarchies survive, not only through obvious cruelty, but through repeated reminders about whose life is considered the main plot and whose life is handled as a supporting logistics question. Vanessa got into college the way people like Vanessa often do, through enough partial effort, enough parental smoothing, enough emotional weather systems around deadlines that everyone got exhausted and called the final result resilience. She changed majors twice, failed statistics once, moved back home after one semester because the dorm wasn't a healthy environment, went back the next year with a new wardrobe, a new idea of herself, and a fresh round of family funding. I, meanwhile, did the less photogenic thing. I stayed local, went to community college for accounting while working almost full-time, transferred later, kept receipts, learned systems, built slowly, made very few announcements. To my parents, this was not impressive. Vanessa's life looked expensive. Mine looked disciplined. My parents had always preferred things that photographed well. The moment the scapegoat dynamic fully set in happened when I was 21. Vanessa had maxed out 2 credit cards and withdrawn money from an account my parents had helped us both open years earlier. Not a shared account, officially, but an account my mother still had access to because she believed boundaries were rude if they slowed down family. I noticed because my balance was wrong. It was not a huge amount in abstract terms, $2,300. But when you are 21 and doing your own tuition math, $2,300 is not abstract. It is rent. It is books. It is breathing room. I confronted Vanessa first. She sat on the edge of my bed in our old house, twisting one of my hair ties around her wrist, and said, "I was going to put it back." "From where?" I asked. She looked offended. "I don't know why you're being so intense." That line should probably be carved into the walls of houses, where one child is always expected to absorb the reality of another child's irresponsibility gracefully. I said, "You stole from me?" She said, "It's not stealing if it's temporary." I went downstairs and told my parents. My mother looked shocked for about 4 seconds. Then tired. My father asked Vanessa if it was true. She started crying before she answered. And once she cried, the entire moral structure of the room changed. Vanessa said she had been drowning. She said she didn't know how bad things were. She said she thought I'd understand. She said she had meant to fix it before I noticed. She said hearing me use the word stole made her feel disgusting. My mother started rubbing her back. My father's face took on that familiar look of dealing with complexity. Then he turned to me and said, "You didn't have to confront this so harshly." That was the moment. The purest one. Not because Vanessa took the money, because my family watched her take it and still believed my tone was the more urgent problem. My mother said, "Claire, your sister is obviously in a fragile place." I said, "What about me?" My father said, "What about you?" There are sentences that don't sound cruel until years later when you finally hear them with the correct amount of honesty. What about you? What about your money? What about your work? What about your panic? What about your trust? What about you? That night, I moved most of my things into my friend Mara's apartment. Not because I was officially kicked out. Scapegoats are often not expelled in dramatic ways. They are simply shown enough times that their safety is conditional, that leaving becomes the least humiliating option. I kept contact after that. But in smaller doses, holidays, short calls, birthday texts, enough to be considered present, not enough to keep being consumed. Vanessa, meanwhile, kept receiving what I privately called the soft landing package. When she dropped out of school, my parents called it a reset. When she moved back home, they said the economy was difficult. When she dated a guy with no job and a podcast mic, they said she had a generous heart. When she pivoted into branding, then wellness consulting, then creative strategy, they nodded as if reinvention were proof of depth, instead of proof that no one had ever made her sit still inside a consequence long enough to learn from it. I finished school, passed my CPA exam, took a grim but stable job in internal audit, then moved into operations, then into financial systems, then into the side of business people rarely romanticize but always depend on once things get real. What I was good at was this: seeing how money moved, seeing how organizations lied to themselves, seeing where things leaked, seeing what everyone else wanted emotionally and what the numbers would permit physically. I learned to build calm around chaos. No one in my family valued that. Until, of course, they needed it. If this is hitting something real for you, subscribe now. Not because I want to interrupt the story, because stories like this have a way of finding the exact people who were taught that being useful was the same thing as being loved. By my late 20s, I had a reputation for being the person you brought in when a small business was growing faster than its systems could hold. I did restructuring, process cleanup, cash flow correction, latter, strategy and equity. Nothing sexy. Nothing the family would have bragged about at brunch. Everything that actually keeps a life from collapsing after the applause ends. I bought my first condo at 29. Not from inheritance. Not from a husband. Not from luck. From years of living below my means and saying no to things no one photographs. By 32, I had become a partner in a boutique advisory firm that specialized in family-owned businesses with hidden operational messes. That work was so psychologically educational, it almost counts as a second degree. Because when money and family mix, everyone tells themselves they're fighting about numbers when they are actually fighting about love. Entitlement, shame, and rank. I knew that language intimately. I had grown up bilingual in it. That's why when my mother called me after months of silence and said, too brightly, "Vanessa has an opportunity and we'd really love your input," I already knew the real translation. Vanessa had a problem, and somehow I was expected to convert competence into mercy. I should tell you something about my sister at this stage. By then she was 34. Beautiful, charming, chronically almost successful. She had built an online following large enough to sound impressive in rooms full of people who don't know how money works, and small enough that it never translated into durable income. She had done branded content, half-finished a lifestyle course, announced 3 launches that became 1, and married Luke, who loved her in that earnest, passive way. Men often love women. They mistake for purpose. My parents adored Luke because he admired Vanessa and never created reflective surfaces. He let them keep the myth. The problem, though, with a family myth is that reality still sends invoices. By the time of that dinner under the chandelier, my parents had already quietly helped Vanessa with a condo down payment. 2 bridge loans. 1 rebrand. 1 legal cleanup after a vendor dispute. And 6 months of business rent they called temporary support. I knew this not because anyone told me, but because families like mine leak information through tone long before they leak facts through sentences. So when Vanessa placed that embossed folder in front of me and my father said I was the practical one, I knew exactly what part I had been invited to play. Translator, scapegoat, quiet witness, emergency infrastructure. I opened the folder. Inside was a business proposal with too much mood board language and not enough math. Revenue projections with emotional optimism, where evidence should have been cost assumptions that treated staffing like a minor inconvenience. A request section with the kind of typography people use when they want capital to feel like belief. At the bottom was the actual ask. Family investment round. They weren't just announcing a studio. They were asking the room to fund it. My Aunt Ruth set down her fork. Luke said, "We're all in on this." My father said, "We've already committed some seed money." My mother said, "But we thought the family should have the chance to be part of something exciting." Vanessa smiled at me. And there it was, the real invitation. Not come celebrate, come validate, come help, come prove you're not the bitter one. I turned a page, then another. There was a line item for equipment that was absurdly low. A salary draw for Vanessa that was absurdly high. No tax reserve modeling. No break-even month based in anything other than hope. I said, "Who built this?" Luke said, "We had help." Vanessa's smile tightened. "I did the concept," she said. "And a consultant helped structure it?" I said, "This isn't structured." My mother's face changed. "Claire?" she said. There it was again. Tone, not truth. I looked at Vanessa. "This isn't a viable plan." Luke shifted in his seat. My father said, "Can we not be immediately negative?" Negative. Another family favorite. They never used that word when Vanessa ignored numbers. They used it when I read them. Vanessa said, "I knew you'd do this." I asked, "Do what?" "Act like because your life is spreadsheets. Everybody else's dream is stupid." You learn. In certain families, that competence always becomes arrogance the moment it refuses to subsidize fantasy. I closed the folder gently. "It's undercapitalized." I said, "The revenue assumptions aren't credible. The personal draw is too high. The vendor estimates are incomplete. And if you're asking family to invest without clear ownership terms, that's not support. That's extraction." Luke blinked. My mother went pale. My father made the tiny jaw movement he makes right before choosing authority over honesty. Vanessa laughed once. Sharp. "There she is," she said. "The martyr accountant." My Aunt Ruth looked at me then. Not because she was surprised, but because she knew exactly how old that sentence was. Martyr accountant. Cold. Jealous. Difficult. Every family invents vocabulary to make the truth teller feel like the emotional problem. I stood up. Not dramatically. I just stood. Set the folder back on the table. And said, "You didn't invite me here for input? You invited me here for endorsement." Then I picked up my purse. My mother said, "Claire, don't be childish." I turned back slowly. Childish. That from a woman who still believed asking me to fund my sister's self-concept was a neutral dinner topic, I said, "No. Childish would be pretending numbers change because they hurt your feelings." Then I left. That should have been the end of it. But golden child systems do not end when the scapegoat exits a room. They escalate. 3 days later, my mother called crying. My father's business, an industrial packaging company he had bought into years earlier, was in trouble. Not because the core business was failing. Exactly. Because the back office was a mess. Vendor disputes, cash flow timing problems, unpaid state filings, a credit renewal issue, too many years of doing things on instinct and handshake authority, and, most importantly, because my sister had recently helped them with brand expansion and client experience modernization, which is a beautiful phrase for spending money no one had and restructuring chaos no one understood. My father had let Vanessa redesign part of the company image, oversee customer presentation materials, and participate in some vendor relationships because he wanted to believe her creative leadership could finally mature into something concrete. Instead, she had helped create contracts no one tracked properly and expenses no one reconciled correctly. My mother said, "Your father needs guidance." I said, "From me." Silence. Then she said, softly, "You know things." It is always striking when the family that trained itself to overlook your value is suddenly forced to speak around it. I asked what exactly was happening. She gave me fragments, enough for me to understand the essentials. They had a financing review in 3 weeks. Their controller had quit. A vendor was threatening action. And a potential private buyer had expressed interest if the books could be cleaned fast enough. I should have said no. A younger version of me would have said yes instantly because she still confused being needed with being seen. The version of me sitting in my kitchen that morning, holding cold coffee and staring at the city through rain on the glass, knew better. So I said, "If I help, it's through my firm." My mother said, "Can't you just come look at things?" No, because just come look at things is how capable daughters end up doing 40 hours of labor for gratitude that expires the second they say no to the next request. I said, "No, through my firm, with contracts." She went quiet. Then she said, "Your father isn't going to like that." I laughed, a real laugh, short and dry. "I'm not auditioning to be liked." She exhaled. That tired sound women make when they realize reality is not going to rearrange itself into nostalgia for them. 2 days later, my father called. He did not apologize. He did not mention the dinner. He said, "If we engage your firm, I assume you can be professional." There are men who would rather swallow glass than let a daughter hear need in their voice. My father had built an entire life around never needing correction from women who knew more than him in any category he respected. "Yes," I said, "I can be professional." That line carried more history than he deserved. I assigned the case carefully, not because I wanted distance from the truth, because proximity changes power. I remained lead partner on the restructuring, but I kept documentation formal, routing clean, meetings scheduled, and deliverables explicit. If my family wanted access to my competence, they were going to receive it inside structures they did not control. That was the beginning of the long return. The office smelled like printer toner, lemon cleaner, and old stress. When I walked into my father's company for the first review, Nothing had changed, and everything had. Same receptionist desk. Same framed industrial awards on the wall. Same fake ficus tree near the conference room. But the energy had shifted. When people know an institution is unstable, the air itself becomes watchful. My father met me at the glass door to the conference room with the stiff, over-formal politeness men use when they are trying to turn humiliation into process. Vanessa was already inside. Of course she was. She wore a cream blazer. Too much perfume. And the same expression she always had when she believed she was still close enough to influence the story. Luke sat beside her, smiling less than usual. My mother had come too, though there was no operational reason for her to be there. That is another feature of dysfunctional families. Even business meetings become emotional tribunals. I opened my laptop, set down the printed review packet, and started walking them through reality. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just accurately. Vendor exposure, cash timing, inventory mismatch, receivables lag, untracked obligations, brand spending without measurable return, contractual language added by someone who did not understand deliverable liability. At one point, Vanessa interrupted and said, "I was trying to modernize the company." I looked at her and said, "You were trying to decorate instability." Luke stared down at the table. My father said my name in warning. But here is the thing. When you build enough real authority outside your family, their tone stops functioning as governance. It just becomes weather. So I kept going. I explained what had to happen: expense freeze, vendor renegotiation, client retention triage, liquidity control, and sale readiness prep if they wanted a viable offer. Then I said the part none of them expected. The strongest interested buyer is us. The room went silent. My father stared. My mother actually blinked twice like she thought she had misheard. Vanessa leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means my firm is part of the acquisition group reviewing your company." My father's face changed in stages. Disbelief, pride trying to rise, pride realizing it had no clean way to rise, then a form of anger so controlled, it barely moved his mouth. "You're buying my company?" I said, "We're evaluating whether to." Vanessa said, "Since when do you own part of an acquisition group?" And that right there was the thesis of my entire family. They had not hated the possibility of my success. They had simply never bothered to imagine it as structurally real. I should tell you where the macro peak of this story begins. Not with that meeting. That meeting was only the first fracture. The real peak began 3 weeks later. At my parents' anniversary dinner, the same dinner where Vanessa had first tried to pass around that fantasy folder. The guest list was larger this time. Extended family, a few long-term family friends, 2 former business associates of my father's, my Aunt Ruth, Luke's parents, and, critically, one attorney from the acquisition side who had insisted on being there because the purchase terms required signatures the following week and certain family-held assumptions were becoming obstacles. Vanessa thought the dinner was about reconciliation. My mother thought it was about saving face. My father thought it was about preserving authority. I knew it was the night the family story was going to split open in public. Before I tell you exactly what happened, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I always like knowing how far these stories travel. I almost didn't go. A sane person might not have, but there are certain nights where absence allows the family to keep lying in a shape too flattering to them. I had spent enough of my life leaving rooms so they could keep their version tidy. I wore a camel blazer, ivory blouse, and simple gold earrings. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. I wanted to look exactly like what I was. Stable. Adult. Unavailable for rewriting. When I arrived, the dining room looked almost identical to the previous dinner, which felt appropriate. Dysfunction loves a repeated stage. Vanessa was radiant with that special kind of brightness people wear when they think they can still engineer the emotional weather. She hugged me too quickly and too tightly and said, "I'm really glad you came." No, she wasn't. She was glad there were witnesses. My father raised a glass at dessert and started giving a speech about family. Perseverance. Hard seasons. And what really matters. It was one of those speeches people give when they are standing on top of a version of the truth they hope the room will agree not to disturb. Then he did what I should have predicted. He turned to Vanessa and said, "And whatever happens next? No one can say our girl hasn't always had vision." My Aunt Ruth closed her eyes. Briefly. Just once. My father kept going. "She dreams bigger than the rest of us. Some people are built to lead. Some people are built to support. Families work when everyone understands the difference. There are moments when an entire childhood comes back into your body, not as memory, but as structure." I felt it then. Every dinner. Every redirected blame. Every, "Why weren't you watching her?" Every, "You didn't have to be so harsh." Every, "What about you?" Support. That was the word he chose. My mother smiled into her wine. Vanessa touched Luke's hand and looked down in a performance of humble gratitude so transparent I almost admired its consistency. Then my father said, "And I know the last few months have been complicated, but at the end of the day, blood matters, family matters, and everyone here knows who has always carried the heart of this family." He meant Vanessa. Everyone knew he meant Vanessa. The attorney at the far end of the table set down his fork. I still remember that tiny sound. Porcelain. Silver. Decision. He said, politely, "Richard, before anything else goes further tonight, I think the purchase structure should probably be made clear." My father froze. Just slightly. The room adjusted around the sentence before anyone knew exactly why. My mother looked from him to the attorney. Vanessa smiled uncertainly. My father said, "This isn't business dinner." The attorney said, "It became one when the family started discussing leadership and continuity. There are some men you hire, not because they are kind, but because they are immune to social theater." I appreciated him in that moment more than I ever told him. My Aunt Ruth looked straight at me. Vanessa's smile finally slipped. "What purchase structure?" she asked. No one answered quickly enough. So I did. "The company sale." Silence? Not TV silence. Not cinematic silence. The real kind. Fork halfway lowered. Eyes recalculating. Air suddenly expensive. Luke said, "What company sale?" My father stood up. Claire. Just my name, but it contained a lifetime of command. Warning. Embarrassment. And disbelief that I might actually speak in a room he had curated. I stood too. Not to match him. To make sure I wasn't answering that voice from the seated position it expected. I said, "The company isn't being preserved for Vanessa to step into. It's being sold. My firm is part of the acquisition group. I hold the largest individual decision share." No one moved. Vanessa laughed first. That brittle little laugh people use when their body is trying to buy time for a mind that has already lost the room. "That's not funny," she said. I said nothing. The attorney opened a slim folder and placed it on the table. My mother's hand flew to her throat. Luke looked at Vanessa, like he had just realized the script she had been promising him had fewer pages than she claimed. Vanessa said, "Louder now. You're saying she's buying Dad's company?" The attorney said, "I'm saying Ms. Mercer is the principal approving partner on the acquisition side." There are sentences that don't merely change a room. They reveal the room that was always there under the one everyone preferred. My father sat down very slowly. My mother whispered, "Claire." Not with accusation this time, with something far more disorienting. Recognition. Vanessa stared at me. Her face lost polish in layers. First offense, then confusion, then something I had spent my whole childhood being accused of feeling toward her and had almost never actually felt. Envy. She said, "Since when?" And there it was again. Not what did you build, not how did you do it, not I was wrong. Since when? As if the timeline of my competence mattered more than the fact of it. I said, "Since while everyone was busy funding your potential, I was building a life." You could have heard the chandelier hum. My father said, "This isn't how family handles things." That line almost made me smile. Because men only say that when family has been working perfectly well for them until the power starts moving. I said, "No, this is how business handles things. Family handled things when you kept telling yourselves she was the future, and I was just support." My mother started crying, quietly. Luke looked ill. Aunt Ruth leaned back in her chair and, for the first time all night, looked almost peaceful. Vanessa stood up so fast, her chair scraped. "This is insane," she said. "You think because you're good at spreadsheets you won?" Won. There is always a moment where the golden child reveals what they thought the game was. Applause. Rank. Beauty. Attention. I said, "No. I think because I showed up for my own life when no one else did. I don't need any of you to tell me what I am anymore." My father's face had gone gray around the mouth. The attorney said nothing. He didn't need to. The documents were on the table. And then the final crack came from the person no one in my family had ever really counted on to tell the truth. "Luke." He looked at Vanessa and said, in a voice so tired, it barely sounded like him, "Did you know?" She turned toward him in shock. "What? Did you know the company was being sold? Did you know they weren't handing you anything?" Her silence lasted 3 seconds too long. That was enough. My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before. Not grief. Not exactly. More like the sound of a woman finally hearing all the lies she had spent years dressing as hope. And my father, who had spent most of my life assigning leadership, value, and promise like he had inherited the right, looked at me and said the line that should have satisfied me and mostly just made me tired. "I misjudged you." I believed him. That may be the saddest part. Not because he lied, because he finally told the truth so late that the truth itself had nowhere warm left to land. Vanessa sat down hard. The attorney quietly slid the signature page back into his folder. My Aunt Ruth reached for my wrist under the table and squeezed once. Small, steady, enough. The aftermath took longer than the reveal. It always does. My mother called 3 days later and said she wanted to meet without anyone else there. We met at a cafe halfway between her neighborhood and mine because neutral ground matters when you are trying. Awkwardly. To become honest. After decades of convenience. She cried. She said she had always known something was wrong. She said she thought keeping peace would eventually become the same thing as protecting both of us. She said she had confused avoiding conflict with being kind. I listened. Then I said, "You didn't protect both of us? You protected the version of the family that required me to carry what nobody wanted to look at." She cried harder. I did not comfort her. Not because I wanted to punish her, because the old reflex of taking care of the person who failed me was finally starting to break. My father never apologized beautifully. That would have required a softness he did not know how to survive in. He apologized in fragments. He sent an email about documents that contained one unnecessary line. "I know you were right more often than I let myself admit." Later. He called once and said, "I should have listened when you were younger." That was as close to remorse as he ever came. Vanessa, unsurprisingly, took the longest. For months she alternated between contempt, silence, self-pity, and strategic vulnerability. She sent me one message that said, "You always needed to feel superior." Another that said, "I hope you're happy." Another that said, "I never asked to be put in that role." That last one was the only honest thing she had ever said to me. Because she hadn't. Golden children are made too. They just get rewards instead of scars for participating. I wrote back once. I said, "You didn't ask for the role, but you did use it every time it benefited you." Then I stopped replying. That is one of the hardest things people who grow up in family hierarchies have to learn. Understanding someone is not the same thing as granting them access. My firm acquired the company 6 weeks later. Not because I wanted revenge, because it was financially sound after restructuring, and because I knew exactly how to separate sentiment from systems, which was the very skill my family had always mistaken for coldness. My father stayed on in an advisory capacity for 8 months. That was my choice. Not because he deserved it, because ending everything all at once would have felt like reenacting the same totalizing logic my family used on me when I was younger. Boundaries are not always the same thing as destruction. Sometimes they are measured exits. Vanessa did not join the company. That was non-negotiable. Luke left 2 months after the dinner. I do not say that with satisfaction, only recognition. A lot of marriages survive on shared illusion longer than people think. My mother and I have something now that is not closeness exactly, but maybe honesty with limited seating. She calls. Sometimes I answer. Sometimes I don't. When we meet, she no longer talks around the facts of the past. That matters. My father and I do better at logistics than intimacy. He sends articles sometimes, badly chosen ones. Once about female leadership, once about resilience, once about business succession like a man trying to mail remorse through topics instead of language. I usually respond with 1 or 2 lines. Vanessa and I are not close. I don't think we ever will be. That is not bitterness. It is architecture. Some things can be renovated. Others can only be acknowledged for the load they cannot safely bear anymore. Before I tell you what I finally learned from all of this, type scapegoat in the comments if you know what it feels like to be blamed for the emotional temperature of a room you didn't create. A few months after the acquisition closed, I went back to my old neighborhood for the first time in years. The air smelled like cut grass and hot pavement. The same corner store still had a handwritten sign in the window promising the cheapest ice in town. The street where I used to wait for the bus looked smaller, which is one of the quietest shocks of surviving a childhood. I parked outside the old house and sat there for a minute. Not because I wanted to go inside, because I wanted to look at it with the eyes I had now instead of the ones I had then. When I was young, I thought the hierarchy in that house was a verdict. Vanessa was adored. I was tolerated. Therefore, she was more lovable, more special, more worth building a future around. It took me years to understand something far less flattering and much more useful. Golden child systems are not built around worth. They are built around convenience. The golden child carries the fantasy. The scapegoat carries the cost. One is protected from reality. The other is trained by it. And because being trained by reality hurts, the people who benefit from the fantasy call it harshness, negativity, coldness, pride. But the truth is simpler. I survived by learning what was real. They suffered because they kept investing in what only looked good under warm light. That is what I would tell the younger version of me now. Not that she was secretly better. Not that one day everyone would cry and apologize and everything would make narrative sense. I would tell her, you are not being overlooked because you have less value. You are being overlooked because your value does not flatter the emotional economy of this house. You will be called difficult when you are accurate. You will be called cold when you refuse to subsidize other people's delusions. You will be called selfish when you stop donating your nervous system to people who confuse your steadiness with availability. And one day the people who built their identities around underestimating you will discover that reality has been on your side the whole time. Not because reality loves the good. Reality is not sentimental. Because reality eventually invoices everyone. So yes, my golden child sister got everything. The praise, the money, the excuses, the room, the benefit of the doubt, the second and third and 10th chance. And I got the blame, the labor, the discipline, the loneliness, the ugly, unphotogenic education of becoming someone no one was coming to save. But when the family finally discovered who had actually succeeded, it wasn't a triumph in the way people imagine. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't a speech with violins under it. It wasn't revenge pure enough to make me feel healed by the end of dessert. It was quieter than that, harder too. It was a room full of people realizing they had spent years mistaking dependence for brilliance and discipline for bitterness. It was my father hearing his own hierarchy fail in public. My mother understanding too late that peace bought by sacrificing one child is not peace. My sister seeing, maybe for the first time, that attention and adulthood are not interchangeable. And it was me standing in that room with no need to beg for the role of reality anymore. That was the real success. Not making them admire me. No longer needing them to. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. And tell me where you're watching from, and whether the family scapegoat is usually the one who learns how to build a real life.